Welcome to Buckeyes Tomorrow Morning for Tuesday, June 2nd. I'm your host, Tom Orr. The Ball State game in 95 days, the game against Michigan in 183 days. We are sponsored by Jeff Ruby's of Columbus, the award-winning upscale steakhouse in downtown Columbus. Named one of the top 50 steakhouses in America by Food Network. Just go to jeffruby.com/Columbus to check out the menu and make a reservation today. All right, we're welcoming in Ross Fulton, the X's and O's guru from BuckeyeInsider.com. Ross, we're talking about an article written by Cody Alexander. That is someone that we've talked about a bunch on the show over the years. He just wrote a look back at Matt Patricia's first season at Ohio State and what he did on defense called Complex Looks, Simple Systems. And I will put a link in the comments on YouTube as well as in the description of the podcast. And if I fail to do that, go ahead and yell at me in the comments, and then I will put the links in there. But Ross, what does Complex Looks, Simple Systems, what does that mean? And then how does that really sort of play out on the field?
Yeah, I highly recommend all of Cody's articles and material. But as you said, this is a great article about Ohio State's on its first year under Matt Patricia. And I think it plays out in the sense of, I think what Cody means by that is the schemes are relatively simple and straightforward for the defense to execute. Like, we'll get into that. But, a single high cover 3 base scheme is certainly not something new. That's been around for a long, long time in football. But the ways that Patricia was able to move around the pieces and mix up the front, mix up the ways that Ohio State ran cover 3, and sort of move some key pieces around, namely his 2 linebackers in Sonny Styles and Arvell Reese in particular, and then Caleb Downs as the strong safety and the nickel, and sort of move, and rotate the coverage in the front. It made it so that it looked complex for the opposing offense, but kept the scheme for the players on defense relatively simple to execute.
All right, so we're going to just go level by level here, and we're going to start up front. That's where it all starts. It always starts up front. We're going to start there. We have talked about the penny front a bunch, but for people who maybe don't remember or who just have kind of always heard you say it and not really understood what it is, explain what the penny front is and what that allowed them to do last year.
The penny front is a odd 5-1 front, so it's used in nickel defense. So I guess we should start out even more basic level. Ohio State, as we discussed, is a majority nickel team. So they have 4 down linemen, 2 linebackers, and 5 defensive backs. Obviously, they sometimes respond to 12 personnel or 2 tight ends with a 3rd linebacker. But, putting that aside, base nickel. And so if you think about your traditional odd front, like a 3-4 defense, you have 2 linebackers. And so the term penny came from the fact that you only have 1 linebacker off the ball. So single linebacker, hence penny. But really what it was for Ohio State is, they essentially so same personnel, again, to the simple part, but rotated 1 linebacker down as an edge defender and played a head-up nose guard. So, as Cody discussed in the article, that most often was Arvell Reese, who would bump down to play to the weak or boundary edge. So think about, away from the tight end or to the short side of the field. And then as I said, you have a straight up over the center nose tackle, who's last year was Caden McDonald, and we can talk about the relevance of that for the penny going forward. And then, most of the time, Sonny Styles was the off-ball middle linebacker, but as Cody discussed in the article, while as I said, the principal formation or look was with Arvell Reese as the walk-up boundary. That could be rotated, right? So they could rotate it towards the field. They could have Sonny Styles on the edge of the field and Arvell Reese off the ball. They could play Reese to the wide side of the field, and then they could use Caleb Downs a lot in the box. So that essentially from, that 5-1 look could become a 5-2. And so, Cody says that according to his stats, Ohio State was in the penny front the majority of the snaps. That, that seems a little high to me, but I would say that it was certainly about as frequent as your standard, 4-2 look that we've come to traditionally associate with Ohio State over the last decade or so with 2 off-ball linebackers.
One of the questions you always get asked about a defensive coordinator is how aggressive are they? How often are they blitzing? And last year, at least according to his numbers, they didn't blitz as much as you might have thought, but they got a little bit creative. He used an interesting phrase, passive pressure. So what is passive pressure? What does that look like in the Matt Patricia defense?
Yeah, I would agree with Cody. I mean, I think that Patricia was pretty, sparing in his blitz schemes. As Cody talks about, most of the time they were 5-man pressures. And so, we can get into the coverages here in a second. But most of the time it was, 5-man look with a cover 3 fire zone behind it. So if your standard cover 3 is 3 deep and 4 under defenders, you're playing 3 deep and 3 under. So again, like to that overarching, like complex but simplified, you can bring a 5th rusher from different angles, but you're still sort of playing the same basic cover scheme for the defense. Again, as with the penny front, and I think that going back to the fact that they had Caden McDonald as nose tackle and to play that head up over the center and 2 gap, I think one of the outstanding questions going for next year is will they be able to do that? Will their nose tackles and particularly their one techniques be able to fill that role? I think that it may be the case this year that Ohio State needs to increase its pressure schemes, in particular, more use of sim pressures, where you're bringing 4, but you're dropping a guy off, and playing a zone coverage behind it, or just bringing a bigger variety, because I just think they're going to maybe need to generate some more pressure than just relying on their defensive ends and Arvell Reese to do it organically. But as Cody talks about, even last year you saw a lot of, in particular, what Patricia liked to do is bring either a nickel pressure from the field side or bring Caleb Downs on a boundary pressure from the boundary side, and then drop a defensive end out. And so that's where you get that, third coverage, third underneath coverage man. So that's kind of what by passive, you're bringing 5, but you're still playing as a zone behind it that's fairly protective.
All right, then, and on the back end, Cody had a really interesting breakdown of sort of the percentages of different coverages that they ran last year. One thing that really jumped out to me is Matt Patricia had a reputation for using one kind of coverage in the NFL, and then that was not really what you saw the majority of the time in year 1 at Ohio State.
Yeah, I think Cody drew an interesting parallel or connection between the two that I really thought fully through, because as Cody said, in the NFL, Patricia, particularly with the Lions when he was a head coach, played a ton of cover 1 man. And so, as we've talked about, there's been times where Ohio State has been a heavy cover 1 team. And so you have your single middle of the field safety, and then you're playing cover 1 across. But so what Patricia did is basically substituting doing that with cover 3. So a lot of the same principles there, right? You still have a middle of the field safety, but now you're just playing a zone instead of man. And so you're having, your corners each have a deep third, that deep middle of the third player, and then you have 4 underneath defenders. And a big part of that, by playing a lot of zone and cover 3, what it allowed Ohio State to do, again, to pick up on that complex, looks concept, you could rotate the coverage a lot. And so we've talked about this a lot, particularly going forward with how Ohio State approached the transfer portal, wanting, Earl Little to be that nickel, and then have, Jalen McClain bump down to play Downs' role. And then you have Terry Moore to be more of that middle field safety. You have the ability, and that's what Cody uses the term fulcrum from last year, to push the coverage. So there'd be a lot of times last year as we'd see Lorenzo Styles, who was the field nickel, rotate back to be a deep safety, and Caleb Downs come down to the boundary side, or you can rotate to the field and have Downs come back. So it allows you to shift. So even within your base cover 3 look, you can play, Cody has some example of this, you can play cover 3 buzz. So you're playing, rotating to the weak side, you can rotate to the strong side. And so you see a lot of this. And again, that gets to some of these transfers, whether it's, as I said, Little, or, bringing in Christian Allegro from Wisconsin to sort of play that resort role. There's, again, a lot of focus on these sort of these, edge or fulcrum players, if you will, to fill those roles that Cody focuses on in that article that, allowed Patricia to really kind of rotate the defense one way or the other.
You kind of touched on this a little bit already, but I wanted to really just sort of ask it directly. You've mentioned a bunch of guys who are not there. You've said Caden McDonald's name a bunch in terms of the impact up front. You don't have Caleb Downs anymore this year. You don't have Arvel Reese. You don't have Sonny Styles. Those are all names that I've heard you say. Those guys are all gone, and they have certainly a bunch of new players and a bunch of guys they're very high on this year. But we know what the year one defense looked like under Matt Patricia. How much do you think it's going to change in year two just because of the different personnel? And is there something that really jumps out as like, this is a really obvious change that I expect them to make year two based on either the guys who left or the guys who they brought in?
Yeah, it'll be interesting because, as I said, like sort of on the one hand, you don't have that Caden McDonald giant nose tackle in the middle to play the zero technique. Like you have, Will Smith back, who was his backup, and you brought in John Walker, and potentially you could play James Smith in there as well. But it's, I will say it's like not a traditional like two technique where he's trying to sort of hold up the center. Like Caden McDonald used a lot of like what we call like a lag technique. Like he would basically play if the center blocked to his right, let's say, he would take the backside A gap and the defense would adjust from there. So he like played opposite the way the center was going. So I think there's ways around not having him. But on the flip side, I felt like, and we talked about this, like their transfer portal moves really spoke to me that like maybe even leading more so into the odd front. You have, I said, like Allegro, who's able to be like the big body, like boundary edge linebacker like Reese was. You have Rusal, who's kind of like more of like a defensive end outside linebacker hybrid on the flip side, who can drop. We were talking about those zone blitzes, like can cover the curl flat zone opposite if you're bringing a blitz. And then we talked about, and that allows them. And then they have both James Smith and Edric Houston. So, the penny front, the one thing I didn't mention, you have the nose, and then you have kind of like the two other defensive tackles, if you will, are sort of what you might call like a 4-eye technique. So they're kind of like lined up on the outside leg of the guard. And so you could, in theory, have, James Smith and Edric Houston on the field at the same time in each of those roles and get bigger with like Kenyatta Jackson outside and then Allegro, or you can get kind of smaller and push Jackson back inside like he did more last year. So they do have some flexibility to run that penny front. So I do think we'll see more of that. And then, as I said, I think when you look at the back end, like a lot of focus was on the versatility of the safeties, particularly like having Earl Little, who can play in the box, but can also drop back in coverage. And so like, I think, when people talk about, wanting the nickel to cover in man, again, like as Cody showed, like Ohio State's like an overwhelmingly zone team, or they were last year. And I expect that to continue again because of just the type of guys they were looking for to play safety. They really want to be able to disguise the coverage, and it's much easier to do that with this cover 3 zone shell, and they, as Cody discussed, like then you mix in some cover 2 to keep, offensive off balance. You mix in some quarters or, quarter, half. And so it's just a principally zone framework. And we noticed, mentioned this as well, noticed like against Miami when Styles got hurt, they had to play more man because they had to bump Jermaine Matthews into nickel. And that really like cut down a lot of this versatility that Cody discusses in the article. Because once you're in man, you're kind of locked into where people have to be.
All right, so there you go. Your first breakdown from Ross Fulton, X's and O's guru at BuckeyeInsiders.com. If you enjoy hearing Ross talk about football, you want to talk with Ross about football, great place to do it is that at BuckeyesInsiders.com. That is coming very soon. You can sign up to get email updates on the latest on the website and all that. You can also find us, of course, on Twitter. You can find us on Instagram. You can find us on YouTube at youtube.com/@BuckeyeInsiders.com. Nope, it's youtube.com/@BuckeyeInsiders. I'll get that right eventually. One thing you will always get right is if you go to Jeff Ruby's of Columbus, proudly offering nationally acclaimed USDA prime steaks, seafood and sushi, impeccable service, live entertainment, and an attention to detail that is simply unmatched. Go to jeffruby.com/Columbus to check out the menu and make a reservation today. That will do it for today. Thank you guys all for joining us. Have a great day. We'll talk to you tomorrow.